This week we're speaking on the digestive system, and I want to start out by going over in a general way what the digestive system is all about. First of all, digestion begins when you take something into your mouth and do the process known as mastication. Mastication is the process of chewing your food, and it initiates digestion. Now you remember, as I do, your mom always telling you, make sure you chew your food. Well, this was not an idle recommendation. This is actually quite important because digestion begins with how well you chew your food. And you can see that mastication starts what is known as a mechanical breakdown with chewing, and it also mixes saliva in with the food, which lubricates the food to make it easier for it to go down the passageway. And also in saliva are enzymes that break down carbohydrates. Digestion is the process of breaking down food molecules into their individual components. For example, proteins are made up of peptides, which are made up of amino acids. And in the process of digestion, the idea is to break down the long protein chains into individual amino acids so that they can be absorbed into the body. Similarly, carbohydrates are generally ingested as long chains of sugars, which are broken down into single sugar molecules to be absorbed in that way. And absorption is the process where nutrient molecules are taken from the GI tract and into the blood. Now, once absorption is completed, anything that's not absorbed is the water is eventually taken out of it, and then it's eventually eliminated from the body. To quote Jesus, it's eliminated in the draft. Now, we're going to use this diagram to do a brief overview of the organs in the digestive tract. First of all, as usual, we start at the top, and we start with the tongue. The tongue is important because it helps move the food around so that when we're doing the process of chewing, we can move the food around and mix it thoroughly. This is a salivary gland. There are actually 3 salivary glands that we'll point out in a future slide. The salivary gland supplies saliva, and saliva has a lubricating function as well as introducing an enzyme known as amylase, which breaks apart complex sugar molecules. The tube that leads from the mouth down into the stomach is known as the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube, and food doesn't just sort of roll down or fall down the esophagus into the stomach, but it is by a process known as peristalsis, which is a circular muscular contraction which propels food. It is propelled down the esophagus and into the stomach. You can show this by actually standing on your head and eating or drinking something, and you'll find that even standing on your head, the food still goes into your stomach, and that's because of the peristaltic function. Apart from the stomach, there are a few organs that are separate from the lumen of the digestive tract, and one of these is the liver, which is shown here. But when food proceeds down the esophagus, it ends up in the stomach. Now, once the liver is produced, what it's going to produce, a lot of that ends up in this small globular structure that's underneath the liver, that's known as the gallbladder. Also, apart from the central GI tract, is this other accessory organ which produces more digestive enzymes. It's called the pancreas. Now, we've talked about the pancreas before. The pancreas is an important organ in the endocrine system, producing both glucagon as well as insulin, but it is also an extremely important organ in digestion because of the enzymes that it makes. Now, when food passes from the stomach, it ends up in the small intestine or small bowel, and then it moves along to the large bowel, part of the large bowel is this very small sort of worm-looking structure that's called the appendix or variform appendix. Variform just means worm-like. And as the waste products go from the colon after the water is absorbed from the colon, they end up in this straight section of colon known as the rectum. And rectum actually comes from the Latin word which means straight. And then lastly, it's dispelled out the opening, which is called the anus. And this diagram you should probably study. This covers most of the structures that you'll be required to know. Not all, but most of the structures you'll be required to know for any quiz or test on this section. Now let's start back at the top and talk a little bit more about what happens in this area. First of all, as I said before, the tongue is an important part of the process, along with the teeth, for mastication as well as initial digestion. Saliva, which contains amylase, acts by lubricating the food so that it moves through the GI tract more easily, but also amylase in the saliva, breaks apart carbohydrate molecules and starch. And then once the food is swallowed, it's propelled into this straight tube that's just beyond the larynx here. It's in this area right here, is the beginning of the esophagus, and it heads down toward the stomach. Now the stomach, which is here on this diagram, in the stomach, food is churned and mixed with other digestive juices, which further digest the food. Now the churning process occurs with peristalsis, and that mechanically breaks food apart. And then chemically, there are enzymes, pepsin and pepsinogen, which break apart proteins and carbohydrates. As this occurs, the food bolus becomes liquid, and at that point, it's thoroughly mixed with enzymes, and at that point, it's called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. And this is what's propelled into the small intestine or small bowel. And the small bowel initially is a site of further digestion. The more proximal part of the small bowel, called the duodenum, there is more digestion that occurs because of enzymes that come from the liver and from the pancreas. And then as the food proceeds more distally in the small intestine, it's absorbed into the bloodstream. So here we have the accessory organs of the GI tract. We have the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. The liver is a very complex organ that picks up many of the absorbed nutrients from the small intestine. The blood flow from the small intestine passes into the liver first, and that's called the enterohepatic circulation. This occurs in order to allow the liver to take up many of the nutrients that are absorbed, but it also allows for the liver to protect the rest of the body from things that may have been taken in that would be potentially toxic to the body. The liver also secretes bile salts. These bile salts frequently are stored in the gallbladder, and they're important for breaking down fats. The gallbladder, which is shown here, is just underneath the liver and then just beyond the common hepatic duct, and bile is stored in the gallbladder, and then when certain fatty foods are eaten and propelled into the small intestine, it will contract, expelling the bile into the small bowel to help digest the fats. The pancreas, which is right in this area right here, this is the main pancreatic duct, and it dispels its juice into the digestive juice into the small bowel in this area. And this digestive juice contains both enzymes that break up proteins as well as fats. The lower digestive tract is primarily the colon and small intestine. The large bowel, or colon, takes generally what's left over after the nutrients are absorbed. Now, at the point in which it enters the colon, which is right in this area here, the right colon, this is the ileocecal valve, which is the valve between the small bowel and the large bowel, approximately 10 liters of fluid come through here every day. Now, obviously, we do not dispel 10 liters of fluid when we go to the bathroom. And so in the process of moving through the colon, all of that water, except for about 300 cc's, is removed. And so the primary function of the large bowel is to reabsorb all the water that was put in to help with digestion and absorption. The rectum is a storage area for solid waste until we're in a place where we can get rid of it, and it's dispelled out through the anus. Now it's interesting, here is a picture of the appendix. The appendix has always been a mysterious sort of organ because for many years it was thought that it had no real function. And actually it was used as an argument in favor of evolution because it seemed to be an organ that had been produced that had no function, so why would God create such an organ? But actually it's thought that the appendix is important actually in two ways. One is it contains a great deal of immune cells and immune material, so it's thought to help or enhance immunity in this area. And then also it contains normal bacteria, and if for some reason the bacteria is lost in the colon, it can be used to reestablish the normal flora in the intestine after an illness. The biofilm is the microscopic environment in the surface of the small intestine, and as we'll see in just a minute, there's a huge number of bacteria that are in the large intestine, and the balance of those bacteria is extremely important to our health. So this biofilm holds not only bacteria, but also immune cells and mucus. And if this biofilm is disrupted by the intake of antibiotics or because of a diarrheal illness, then the individual can become ill because of an overgrowth of bacteria that are not good, that are actually pathogenic. And when that occurs, forms of irritation of the colon can occur, such as and pseudomembranous colitis, which is a type of colitis that occurs when the bacteria flora are messed up.